Hello and welcome to Games from Folktales, a podcast that mixes historical research and tabletop role-playing settings. I'm your host, Timothy Ferguson. This week, Venice, the customs of romance. In the early days of the Republic, women followed the Byzantine custom, which was to be veiled outside of the house and remain in a male-free space much of the time. This is not still followed in 1220, but there are remnant practices which we can still use as plot hooks. The altanes, for example, which we are investing as magical spaces, are a type of male-free space that's now desegregated in theory, but not in daily custom. Similarly, the romantic overtures which were developed at this time persist, even as the strictures which made them necessary loosen. Over to Edgecombe Stanley. Courtship. In public, women were veiled, matrons in black, maidens in white, except upon festivals, which, happily for the sake of dear Prince Cupid, were frequent enough, when they were allowed to appear in church, on the piazza, and in barca or gondola uncovered. These were lovers' opportunities. When a youth had become familiar with the form and carriage of a girl, and was taken therewith, he was wont to haunt the neighbourhood of her father's house in order to get a good look at her features and expression when she came out. If the opinion he had formed was confirmed, then he was accustomed of a night to stand beneath the iron-barred window of his inamatoria, and there breathe out a love ditty, twanging amorously on the strings of his guitar. If the girl responded to the youth's ecstasy, she was permitted to flash a light through the open shutter. The repetition of this signal was an intimation that the wooer might address himself to her father. I'd just like to note that the guitar was almost certainly not used at this point. It's a later instrument. The father's consent was regarded as the first step of the betrothal. Then the happy young couple was required to await the festal day of the good San Marco for the public acknowledgment of the suit. Liberty was meanwhile allowed for interviews and negotiations, with respect to equality of family and the amount of dowry, etc. The girl, dressed simply in white, was permitted to receive visits from her lover and his young companions. Upon the eve of the festival, when many friends were assembled, the bridegroom-elect took the bride's hand in his and slipped a ring upon her finger. Penjay, they called it, as a pledge of his honourable intentions. The girl then withdrew to her mother, while the guests feasted. Nobody went to bed that night, for there was much to be done in preparation for the morrow's nuptials. The bride had to be bathed, her hair plaited into great coils, her dress and ornaments had to be arranged. Finishing touches were put on the festal decorations of the house. Attendance at early mass was de rigueur, and then the bride, covered with a lace or fine net veil, knelt to receive her father's blessing, and at the same time she had placed in her hands by her two sponsors, the most estimable and influential of her father's acquaintances, a casket or purse in which was deposited her dowry. These receptacles were called arcella, and were objects of considerable value from an artistic point of view. If caskets, they were embossed of silver, or carved wood, or painted by hand, and if they took the form of purses, they were of the richest material, beautifully embroidered, and often enough ornamented with pearls and precious stones. A procession was formed of gaily decorated gondolas with wedding guests. The brides contained herself, her father, and her sponsors, and bore silken streamers of blue and white, with two captive white doves at the prow, all made for the island cathedral of San Pietro di Castello, the bride bearing her arcella suspended from her neck by a blue silk ribbon. She knelt at her father's side before the bishop, and then the groom, ushered by his witnesses, took his place at her right hand, and offered her a wedding ring for the episcopal benediction. Removing the pengay, which he slipped on his own finger, he replaced it with a golden hoop of matrimony. Lighted candles were placed in the hands of the couple while the bishop blessed their union. An offering in their behalf is made by the bridegroom's next friend, and then the religious ceremony ends with the singing of a marriage ode. A merry, happy party betook themselves one and all in a fleet of gondolas, scattering on their way sweetmeats and small current coins among the bystanders. A banquet with dancing and singing filled the afternoon, and at dark the minstrel band led the newly married pair to the bridegroom's brilliantly lighted house. The best man had a position of importance. He it was who found the beverages of the guests, toasted the nuptial couple, gave drink and money all round. Early in the morning following the marriage, he repaired to the nuptial chamber, and knocking loudly at the door, offered the happy spouse 2 fresh-laid eggs, often stained and painted exquisitely, and a casket of aromatic pastilles, tokens of good wishes. The bride's girl friends, too, laid beside the door little wickerwork baskets, trimmed with silk and decorated with fresh flowers, and full of delicious sweetmeats and fresh fruit, emblematic again of what married life should ever be. Such were some of the pretty wedding observances in old Venice. The Boccoloa. One of the prettiest of the many charming customs which illustrate so delightfully the ever-fascinating story of Venice, the Venus city of the Adriatic, was the annual presentation of the Boccoloa, the rose nosegay of San Marco. For its origin we must hie us back to a very distant century, the 9th. Doge Orso Badoero, grandson of the Grand Doge Anginello, had a lovely only daughter, Maria, her name by baptism, but by reason of the ardent flashes of her brilliant jet-black eyes, she was known as Vulcana, Vulcana of the Black Eyes. One day there came from far Provence a handsome troubadour with light guitar called Tancred, a child of chance it appears, and he sang outside the dark-eyed beauty's iron-barred window the doughty deeds of knightly prowess. Prince Cupid set to work and began to shoot his love-dipped arrows up and down, till he had transfixed both Vulcana and Tancredo. Alas, the maiden knew her father would never listen to her plea for a simple singing youth, so she wept and sighed and wept. "Go, gentle minstrel," she cried, "tarry not, and seek the court of the King of France, and clothe thyself with the glory of martial renown. I, thy Maria, will wait for thee." With a tender embrace, and the maiden's thin gauze scarf a girder on tied round his arm, the troubadour set off to fight the Moors. Seasons came and went, and beauteous Maria Vulcana, upon the altar of her father's palace, scanned in vain the wide lagoon for signs of her warrior's return. Will Tancredo never come back, she asked herself, and wept and yearned for him. At last rumours of bold adventure and the names of good knights were bandied from tongue to tongue. The dreaded Moors had been vanquished, and the hero of the fights was a youthful soldier called Tancredo of Provence. Well a day, an embassy presented itself in Venice from Charlemagne. Its leader was Sir Roland the Invincible. He sought there for Maria Badoero, the Doge's weeping daughter, but she didn't show herself. Her heart was with Tancredo. She cared for none beside, and at length they met, and Roland, bending over her, sighing, said, "Lady fair, I kiss thy hand for brave Tancredo, and bid thee no more to weep for him. He died in these arms of mine, breathing out thy name. See, he bid me with his last words give thee this red rosebud, which he had plucked for thee, saying, bid her pray for me always." Maria was silent. She paled. Her heart gave one more big throb. She placed the pledge of her Tancredo's love between her breasts, and then laid down and died. This is the legend of the Boccola. The day the heartbroken Maria Vulcana breathed her last was the name day of St. Mark the Evangelist, the 25th of April. Thereafter, every lovelorn lad in the islets of the lagoons offered to get the girl he loved best a freshly gathered red rosebud as a pledge of devotion. The innamorate were accustomed to place the sweet tokens in their open bosom, as did the beauteous but unhappy maiden of older times, and wear it all the livelong day. Sometimes, to be sure, the girl rejected her admirer's gift, but she who could show no rosebud in her bosom suffered mighty heartburns all the same, and her girl companions and the young men of her acquaintance looked askance at her. At the sounding of curfew, all were safe indoors, and then the simple offering withered, as it was taken lovingly between both maidens' hands and caressed affectionately, and placed in a secret hiding-place where it might be long or it might be little before her parents acknowledged her successful suitor. That frail blossom of early summer never lost its fragrance, and many a dewdrop of a tear fell upon the faded petals, whilst the loved one waited impatiently for the next Festa del Marie. The Festa del Marie. The name Pietro Canadino III has come down to us in a gracious, valiant guise. It was the feast of the Purification in the year 944, and the brides of Venice were kneeling before the bishop in the church of San Pietro di Castello. The Doge and Dogeressa and their household were assisting in the ceremony, when suddenly wild figures of daring buccaneers from Trieste dashed into the building. Robbery, not rape, was their primary intention, for the maidens Archel were well worth the risk that the robbers ran. The girls held tightly to their dowries, and so they were borne off bodily by their captors Arcel and Dall. Recovering from their consternation, the menfolk of the congregation and the hangers-on outside laid hands on their weapons, tools, and anything, and were swiftly on the heels of the ravishers. Luckily, the barkers of the Guild of Marriage Chest Makers were moored in the canal, and so available for use. Doge Pietro, divesting himself of his state mantle and girding on his sword, headed the pursuers. Calling on heaven for vengeance, he boarded the foremost boat and bade every armed man to follow. It was the barca of Andrea de Capelli, of the Fondamento of Santa Maria Formosa, the quarter of the makers of hats. He was one of the bridegroom's elect, and mad with rage, he and his companions swore to be avenged and to bring back their brides to Venice. That was a stern chase, to be sure. The robbers rowed their hardest, and the lovers of the brides bent to their sweeps with all their wind and thew. Not till the pirates had crossed the Caole lagoon did Andrea de Capelli's boat grapple with the quarry. Then it was a fight hand to hand, pole to pole, but at last Andrea, leaping into the boletto of the pirate chief, struck the villain down and gathered to his breast his fainting, bedraggled bride. Bearing her light form under his left arm, he neatly beheaded his enemy, and holding aloft the gory trophy, regained his boat. Victory, as by well-bound convention, crowned virtue, and back to Venice rode swiftly the proud flotilla, the happy maidens waving aloft their bridal veils in token of their deliverance. Landing at the Campo of Santa Maria Formosa, all entered the sacred edifice hard by, where the clergy sang Te Deum. The assembly broke up hilariously to spend the evening in universal merriment. Coming out of the church, the master of the Guild of Hatmakers requested a favour of the Doge, by whose side walked the motherly figure of the Dogeressa, her face radiant with smiles, namely, that an annual commemoration of the gallant rescue of the brides of Venice should be instituted, whereat the Doge and Dogeressa should preside. Dandolo gives an amusing account of the interview. "But what if it rains?" asked Doge Candiano. "Why, we will give you hats to cover you." "And what if we come hungry?" "Well, then you shall have the finest catch of fish and the sweetest basket of fruit." "But what if we're thirsty too?" "We will refresh you with the best vintage we possess." And so it came to pass. Every year the Doge and Dogeressa, with all their households and the members of the Grand Council, paid a ceremonial visit to Santa Maria Formosa. Each dignitary received a brand new straw hat, richly gilt and decorated with flowers, a flask of the finest Malvagia, ruddy and rare, and a silver fish, with a golden orange apiece. This is the origin of the Festa del Mare. Stanley is not very clear about this, but the celebration which follows is described relatively simply. 12 poor women engaged to be married are each assigned a rich family who provides them with a dowry and a costume. They are feted for a time, and it's considered good luck to see one of the 12 Marias at a party. There's a lot of competition to have the most widely regarded Maria as protégée of the family, and since her dowry may be far larger than previously expected, there is some attempt to supplant each lady's betrothed. This is a background virtue, providing wealth and social contacts, but it's only available to female characters with high presence. Your saga may vary.